The dust of the Colorado high plains had a taste. It was a fine red grit that settled on the tongue like a premonition of thirst, a constant reminder of the late summer drought of 1889. The land itself was a testament to hardship. Its skin of baked earth cracked into 1,000 tiny fissures around the town of Dry Creek. The town was little more than a collection of weathered buildings huddled together against the ceaseless wind, surrounded by an ocean of sagebrush that shimmered silver and gray under the unforgiving sun. By day, the heat was a physical weight. By night, when the baked earth finally surrendered its warmth to the vast, cold sky, the howls of coyotes drifted down from the foothills of the Rockies, a lonely and ancient music. May Delaney knew the sound well. At 39 years old, she had become a connoisseur of lonely things. She walked with her head slightly lowered, a habit learned not from humility but from a deep-seated desire to be left alone. Her eyes, the color of faded denim, scanned the boardwalk in front of her, noting the splintered planks and the way the red dust collected in the corners. She carried a heavy sewing basket, its wicker handle smooth from years of use. It was her shield and her trade. Inside, neat rows of thread, sharp needles, and beeswax promised order in a world that often felt chaotic. May was a seamstress, and a good one, on occasion, when no one else was available. She was also a midwife, a role she accepted with a reluctance that bordered on dread. The past was a place May tried not to visit. It was a small, airless room in Kansas where the scent of blood and fear still lingered. A difficult birth, a baby that came into the world fighting for every breath, and a town quick to lay blame. It wasn't her fault, the doctor had later admitted in a quiet letter. A faulty instrument, a moment of unavoidable tragedy, but a whisper. Once it takes root, grows faster than any weed. The words had followed her careless, distracted, maybe even cursed, so she had packed her needles and her silence and come here, to Dry Creek, a place so parched it seemed incapable of growing anything, even rumors. Her goal was simple: to earn an honest wage and to be granted the mercy of quiet, to not be noticed. It was a goal she rarely achieved, thanks in large part to Mrs. Larkins. The owner of the general store stood on her porch now, her arms crossed over her formidable bosom, her eyes missing nothing. Mrs. Larkins was the town's unofficial historian and its chief moral accountant, and, in her ledger, May Delaney was a curious and unsettling entry. As May passed, she felt the woman's gaze like a physical touch, sharp and probing. She did not look up, but she heard the murmur from the porch, the words carried on the dry wind, meant for her to hear. Getting on in years for a woman alone, a voice drifted, thin and reedy. It was followed by Mrs. Larkins's own, lower and more certain. "She's 39. I heard. Too old to be dreaming of a new start. Some trees are just meant to grow crooked." May's fingers tightened on the basket handle. Too old to dream. The words were foolish, a casual cruelty meant to sting. But they found their mark. A familiar ache bloomed in her chest, a mix of anger and resignation. She had given up dreaming long ago. Dreams were for young girls with hopeful eyes, not for a woman whose hands were calloused from work and whose heart was scarred by injustice. All she wanted was peace. She forced her shoulders to relax, adjusted the weight of the basket, and kept walking, her sturdy boots making a steady, rhythmic sound on the wooden planks. The dust swirled around her ankles, red and persistent. She had a job to do. Her destination was the Thatcher Ranch, a few miles outside of town. The walk was a familiar one, a journey through a landscape of stark, minimalist beauty. The sun beat down, and the sky was a pale, washed-out blue, a dome of infinite, indifferent space. In the distance, the new barbed wire fences sliced across the horizon, glinting like silver threads. The fences were a source of constant tension in Dry Creek. For homesteaders and ranchers like Eli Thatcher, they meant security, a clear line drawn between what was theirs and what was not. But for men like Adair Pike, whose vast herds of cattle had roamed this land freely for generations, the wire was an insult, a metal serpent choking the life out of the open range. The arguments were as constant as the wind, sometimes flaring into threats muttered over a warm beer in the saloon. As she cleared the last of the town's dusty corrals, the land opened up. A movement to her right caught her eye. On a low rise, silhouetted against the pale sky, stood a wild horse. It was a mare, her coat a shimmering silver gray that seemed to drink the light. Silver Gal. The townsfolk called her. She was a ghost, a legend, a creature of pure, untamed freedom. The mare watched May for a long moment, her head high, her ears pricked. She was cautious, wary, a survivor. Then, with a flick of her tail, she wheeled and galloped away, disappearing into a fold of the hills as if she had never been there at all. May watched her go, a pang of something she could not name tightening her throat. It felt like envy. The Thatcher place came into view soon after. It was a modest ranch, built for survival, not for show. The house was solid, made of thick timber, its porch shaded by a low roof. The barn stood nearby, its wood weathered to the same soft gray as the sagebrush. A few chickens pecked hopefully in the dirt of the yard, and a small vegetable garden fought a losing battle against the heat. It was a place that felt suspended in a state of holding on against the drought, against the falling price of cattle, against the relentless pressure from men like Caleb Wright, the town banker, whose polite letters about overdue loans were more menacing than any open threat. On the porch, hanging from a nail, was a hurricane lamp. Its glass was clean, but May could see that the oil inside was low, barely covering the wick. Yet, as evening approached, it would be lit, a small, defiant flame against the encroaching darkness. It seemed to May a perfect symbol for the man who lived here. Eli Thatcher was 41, a man carved from the same tough, unyielding material as the land itself. He was a widower, his wife, Eleanor, having been taken by a fever the previous winter. The loss had hollowed him out, leaving behind a quiet, stoic grief that clung to him like the ever-present dust. He moved with a heavy deliberation, as if every action required a conscious effort of will. He was in the corral when May arrived, mending a leather strap. Beside him, a small boy sat on the top rail of the fence, as still and silent as a bird on a wire. This was Jesse, Eli's 7-year-old son. The boy had barely spoken a word since his mother died. He watched the world with large, dark eyes that seemed to hold all the sorrow his father kept locked away. His silence was a heavy blanket over the small ranch, a constant, aching reminder of what they had lost. Eli looked up as May approached, his expression unreadable. He was not a handsome man in the traditional sense, but his face had a strength and integrity that was compelling. His eyes were a clear, startling blue, the color of the sky on a crisp autumn morning. "Miss Delaney," he said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't smile, but he nodded his head in a gesture of welcome. "Mr. Thatcher," May replied, her own voice steady. "I've come about the duster." He nodded again and gestured toward the house. "Jesse, go fetch it for Miss Delaney." The boy slid off the fence without a word and ran to the house, his small legs kicking up puffs of dust. He returned a moment later carrying a heavy canvas riding coat, its sleeve torn nearly from the shoulder. He held it out to May, his eyes fixed on the ground. "Thank you, Jesse," May said softly. The boy gave a jerky little nod and retreated to the safety of the fence rail, his gaze turning inward once more. May inspected the coat. It was well worn, but of good quality. A tear like this would require careful work. "I can have it ready by the end of the week," she said, folding the heavy fabric. "That would be fine," Eli said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few coins, placing them in her hand. It was more than she usually charged. "This is too much," she started to say. "The boy needs his winter things looked at as well." Eli interrupted, his gaze shifting to the horizon. A patch on his trousers. "Maybe you could take a look at his coat." It was a statement, not a question. A plea disguised as a transaction. May looked from the silent man to the silent boy. She saw the frayed cuffs of Jesse's shirt, the worn knees of his pants. She saw the exhaustion etched in the lines around Eli's eyes. This was not just about mending clothes. It was about holding a home together with fraying threads. It was a language she understood intimately. "Of course," she said, her voice softer now. "I'll bring my basket next time and do the work here. It will save you the trip." For the first time, a flicker of something gratitude perhaps warmed his blue eyes. "Thank you." There was nothing more to say. The silence settled around them again, broken only by the sighing of the wind and the distant lowing of a cow. May clutched the heavy duster and the coins in her hand. She thought of the whispers in town, the casual judgment of Mrs. Larkins, too old to dream. Maybe they were right, but mending a coat, patching a small boy's trousers, offering a small service for a fair wage, these things were not dreams. They were solid and real. They were the stitches that held a life together, however precariously. She nodded a final time to Eli and turned to leave. As she walked away, she felt two sets of eyes on her back, the man's, weary and watchful, and the boy's, silent and lost. The sun was beginning to dip toward the jagged peaks of the mountains, painting the sky in the shades of bruised purple and pale orange. The air was cooling, and the shadows were growing long. The day was ending, as all days did, in a hush of fading light and the promise of a long, dark night. Back on the porch, the hurricane lamp remained, its reservoir of oil low, waiting for a match and the will to strike it. A few days later, May returned to the Thatcher ranch, the mended duster folded neatly over her arm. The sky had taken on a sickly yellow hue, and the wind had a new, more insistent voice. It whipped her skirts around her legs and carried a fine haze that blurred the edges of the distant mountains. A dust storm was brewing, the first of the season, a dry throat clearing before a harsh cough. She found Eli in the barn, reinforcing a stall door that shuddered with each gust of wind. Jesse was nowhere in sight. "I've finished the coat," she announced, her voice raised to be heard over the rising moan of the wind. Eli turned, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He took the coat, his calloused fingers brushing against hers as he examined the seam. The stitches were small, even and strong, a line of perfect order against the worn canvas. "Good work," he said, his approval quiet but sincere. Before May could reply, a frantic shout cut through the wind. "Mr. Thatcher, sir!" A young man, barely out of his teens, came stumbling toward the barn. It was Tom, one of the ranch hands who lived with his young wife in a small sod-roofed cabin on the far edge of the property. His face was pale with panic. "It is my Mary," he gasped, clutching his side. "The baby! It is coming now! It is too soon!" Eli's face hardened with concern. "Did you ride for the doctor?" "No time," Tom cried, his eyes wide with terror. "She just started screaming. The pains are right on top of each other." The first heavy blast of wind hit the barn then, a solid wall of air and dust that rattled the timbers and plunged the interior into a dim, ochre twilight. Riding to town was impossible now. They were cut off. Eli's gaze fell on May. It was not a question or a plea, but a statement of fact. She was here, and she knew what to do. The old fear, cold and sharp, pierced through May. Kansas rose before her eyes, a vivid tableau of panic and accusation. "I am just a seamstress," she said, her voice tight. "You need a doctor." "You are all we have," Eli said, his voice low and steady, cutting through her panic. He turned to the terrified husband. "Bring her to the barn. It is the warmest place. May, we will need hot water and clean cloths, lots of them." He did not wait for her agreement. He was already moving, his actions decisive, pulling a clean horse blanket from a peg, spreading it over a thick pile of hay in an empty stall. The simple act of taking charge broke the spell of May's fear. There was work to be done. A life, 2 lives, hung in the balance. She pushed the ghosts of the past back into their dark corner and went to find the cloths. What followed was a blur of focused, desperate activity played out against the roaring symphony of the storm. Tom carried his wife, a tiny thing with a face contorted in pain, into the stall Eli had prepared. The air grew thick with the smells of hay, animals, and human fear. May, her hands moving with an instinct she had tried to suppress, did what needed to be done. She spoke in a low, calming voice to Mary, wiped the girl's sweat-soaked brow, and felt for the baby's progress. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, protective focus. Eli was a silent, constant presence at her side. He seemed to anticipate her every need, appearing with a bucket of warm water before she had to ask, holding the lantern high so its light cut through the dusty gloom. He saw the tremor in her hands as she prepared for the final push, but he said nothing. Instead, he simply moved to block the main barn door, his broad back a shield against the worst of the wind, a silent testament of support. He was not a man of easy words, but his actions spoke a language of profound trust. The baby, a boy, came into the world with a weak, mewling cry just as the storm reached its peak. He was terrifyingly small, his skin tinged with blue, his chest struggling to draw breath. Mary, exhausted, sobbed with a mixture of relief and terror. May wrapped the infant in the cleanest cloth she had, her mind racing. The baby's lungs were not ready. The air was too cold, too harsh. "We need to warm the air he is breathing," she said, her voice sharp with urgency. Eli looked at her, his blue eyes questioning but steady. "A funnel," she explained, her hands already moving, searching for materials made of paper or cloth. We hold it over his mouth and breathe warm air into the other end, gently. It was an old country remedy, something she had seen another midwife do once, a desperate measure. Eli found a clean piece of canvas sacking, and with her sewing shears, May quickly fashioned a cone. She showed the new father how to hold it, how to breathe his own warm life toward his son. For long, agonizing minutes, they worked, the three of them, a tiny circle of hope in the heart of the roaring storm. Slowly, miraculously, the blue tinge in the baby's skin began to recede, replaced by a fragile pink. His breathing eased into a shallow, but regular, rhythm. By the time the wind began to die down, the baby was swaddled and sleeping against his mother's breast. The crisis had passed. Exhaustion, heavy and complete, settled over May. In the flurry of activity, she had dropped the small linen handkerchief she always kept tucked in her sleeve. It lay unnoticed in the straw, its corner embroidered with her initials, M.D. Later, after Tom had carried his wife and new son back to their cabin, May was washing her hands in a basin on the porch. The air was calm now, washed clean by the storm, and the setting sun cast long, peaceful shadows. Eli stood nearby, leaning against a post, watching her. "You saved them," he said. It was not praise, just a simple statement of fact. "We saved them," she corrected, her voice weary. It was a near thing. From the corner of the house, Jesse appeared. He had been inside during the storm, a small, silent witness to the drama. In his hand, he clutched her forgotten handkerchief. He looked at it, then at her, his dark eyes filled with a child's solemn wonder. He did not offer it back. Instead, he folded it carefully and slipped it into his pocket, a secret treasure. The next day, the story was all over Dry Creek, and, as stories do, it had changed in the telling. When Mrs. Larkins recounted it at the general store, her voice laced with insinuation. May was no longer a seamstress who had risen to an emergency. "Playing doctor is what I hear," she declared to the small crowd of customers. "Right there in a barn. With her history from Kansas, you would think she would know better than to meddle in things that are not her concern." The whispers started again, the old accusations given new life. May felt the familiar chill of judgment and retreated further into her shell of silence. It was 2 days later that Eli Thatcher sought her out in town. He found her in her small rented room above the Mercantile, mending a dress. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, his large frame filling the space, his hat in his hands. "Miss Delaney," he began, foregoing any pleasantries, "I have a proposition for you." May put down her sewing, her expression wary. "It is about my boy, Jesse," he said, his gaze fixed on a point just over her shoulder. "He needs schooling. He needs a woman's touch around the place. The house is falling to pieces, and I am no good at it." He took a breath. "I would like to hire you, to come out to the ranch for a few hours each day. Teach Jesse to read and write, help with the cooking, the mending. I will pay you a fair wage and provide your midday meal." May stared at him, stunned into silence. It was a practical offer, born of a widower's quiet desperation to hold his world together for his son. But she knew it was more than that. It was an invitation into a life, and an invitation to be scrutinized by the entire town. She thought of Mrs. Larkins's sharp tongue, of the whispers that followed her like her own shadow. "Mr. Thatcher," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "you have heard the talk about Kansas, about what happened in your barn." "I have heard it," he said, his blue eyes finally meeting hers. "I was also in the barn. I saw a woman who was scared but did what was right. I saw a woman who saved a child's life." His simple, unadorned statement of faith was more powerful than any eloquent defense. It chipped away at the wall she had built around herself. Still, the fear of being blamed again was a powerful deterrent. She could not, would not, put herself in that position. "I will accept your offer," she said, her voice gaining strength, "but on my own terms. I will teach your son. I will help with the household chores and the mending. But I am not a midwife. I will not be your doctor. I will not be put in a position of responsibility for anyone's life or health. I am a seamstress who can read, nothing more." Eli considered her terms, his expression serious. Then he gave a single, decisive nod. Agreed. The following Monday, as May was walking the now familiar path to the Thatcher Ranch, a buggy rattled past her. Kicking up a cloud of dust, it was Caleb Wright, the banker, dressed in a smart suit that seemed out of place in the rugged landscape. He tipped his hat to her with a smile that did not reach his eyes, and continued on toward the ranch. By the time May arrived, Wright's buggy was gone, but a new tension hung in the air. Eli was standing by the corral, his jaw tight, staring out at the sliver of land that bordered the dry creek bed. It was the best grazing land on his property, the part with the deepest roots and the most resilient grasses. "Everything all right?" May asked. Eli did not look at her. "Wright was just reminding me that the banknote is due in 2 months, and that the railroad is paying a premium for land with water access." He spat on the ground. He called it a timely opportunity. Before May could formulate a reply, another threat made itself known. Eli's gaze sharpened, focusing on the fence line in the distance. He swore under his breath and began to walk, his strides long and angry. May followed. A 20-foot section of the new barbed wire fence had been cut. The wires snipped clean through and curled back like dead snakes. On the nearest fence post, a symbol had been carved into the wood with a sharp knife. It was a stylized bird with swept-back wings, fierce and predatory. It was Adair Pike's mark, a warning, a promise of more trouble to come. That evening, as May prepared to walk back to town, Eli lit the hurricane lamp on the porch. The wind had picked up again, a low, mournful sound that snaked through the new gap in the fence. The flame in the lamp sputtered and danced, fighting against the drafts. It was a small light, its fuel low, its future uncertain. May stood for a moment, watching the tiny, struggling flame, and saw her own reflection in the glass, a woman on a precarious ledge, with the wind rising all around her. The rhythm of May's days found a new, quiet cadence. Each morning, she would walk the dusty path to the Thatcher Ranch, her sewing basket in one hand and a small bundle of books in the other. The work began in the kitchen, a space that was slowly transforming under her care from a place of grim necessity into a room with a semblance of warmth. But the heart of her day was the lessons with Jessie. Eli had salvaged a large, flat piece of wood from a discarded railroad crate. May had smoothed it with sandpaper and painted it with a mixture of soot and turpentine to create a makeshift blackboard. It leaned against the wall on the porch, a humble altar of learning. Here, May and Jessie entered a world of their own. The boy was a hesitant student at first, his silence a formidable barrier. But May was patient. She did not push. She began not with letters, but with shapes. "Look at the track the chicken just made," she would say, pointing to the dirt. "What does it look like?" Jessie would stare, his brow furrowed in concentration. "A tree," he might whisper, his voice thin from disuse. "It does," May would agree, "a tree with 3 branches. And this letter," she would draw a nitya on the board, "is a tree, too. It makes the ya sound." They found letters everywhere in the arc of a hawk's flight. The S curve of the dry creek bed, the O of the bucket's mouth, slowly, painstakingly. The boy's silence began to fracture, cracked open by curiosity. He began to ask questions, his voice growing stronger with each one. One afternoon, while they were practicing words, a flash of silver caught their attention. On the ridge, Silver Gal stood, her coat gleaming in the sun. Jessie's face, usually so solemn, broke into a rare, breathtaking smile. She came back. He breathed. May smiled with him. "She is a survivor," she said softly. "Some people look at an old mare like that and think she has seen too many winters to be of any use. But she knows where to find water when the creek is dry and how to shelter from the wind. She is not too old to live. Jessie, she is just old enough to know how." The words were meant for the boy, but they settled in her own heart, a quiet affirmation. Her relationship with Eli was a different kind of lesson, one taught in the shared spaces of daily life. He was a man of profound practical skills, but his domestic life was a disaster. His cooking, in particular, was a source of constant, low-grade misery. One evening, as May was preparing to leave, she found him staring glumly into a pot of beans that had boiled into a gray, featureless mush. "They've done it again," he said, "the statement flat with defeat." May peered into the pot. "It looks like you have declared war on them, Mr. Thatcher, and they have surrendered unconditionally." He grunted, a sound that might have been a laugh. "Eleanor, she could make them creamy without them falling apart. I just make paste." "It is the heat," May said, taking pity on him. "You boil them too hard. You have to coax them, not threaten them." She spent the next 10 minutes explaining the subtle art of the simmer, the importance of a slow, patient heat. He listened with the grave attention he usually reserved for cattle prices. A few days later, he presented her with a bowl of perfectly cooked beans. "A temporary truce has been declared," he announced, a slight twinkle in his blue eyes. In return, he taught her things she had never needed to know. One afternoon, he found her struggling to secure a bundle on the back of his saddle. He came over, wordlessly took the rope from her, and with a few deft movements, tied a knot that was both intricate and unshakable. "Cavalry hitch," he said. "It will not slip, no matter how rough the ride." He guided her hands through the motions, his large, calloused fingers surprisingly gentle as they corrected her fumbling attempts. "You pull here to tighten, and here to release." Simple. Their hands brushed, and a current, warm and unexpected, passed between them. They both pulled back at the same time, a moment of awkward awareness in the dusty air. These small exchanges, these trades of knowledge, became the bricks with which they built a tentative bridge of companionship across the lonely expanse of their lives. May remained deeply respectful of the grief that still shadowed the ranch. She learned the geography of Eleanor's memory and trod carefully around it. The most sacred of these places was a large chestnut tree near the house. Jesse would often go there and stand beneath its branches, his small hand resting on its rough bark, his face tilted up as if listening for a song only he could hear. May knew from Eli that it was where his wife used to sit and sing to the boy. She never approached Jesse during these times. She did not offer empty platitudes or try to draw him out. But one afternoon, after he had gone back inside, she walked to the tree and tucked a small, folded piece of paper into a fissure in the bark. On it, she had carefully written out the words to a simple lullaby she remembered from her own childhood. It was a gesture of quiet understanding, a secret left for the boy to find. In Dry Creek, the community remained a jury of divided opinion. The story of the birth in the barn had endowed May with a certain mystique. Some, like the young couple Tom and Mary, treated her with a reverence that made her uncomfortable. Others maintained Mrs. Larkins's attitude of deep suspicion, but there were signs of a thaw. The town's minister, Reverend Howell, was a thoughtful, compassionate man. The Sunday after the dust storm, he had delivered a sermon on the nature of grace. Grace is not a prize for the perfect, he had told his congregation, his gaze sweeping over the pews. It is a gift for those who have stumbled. It is the strength to stand up, brush the dust from our knees, and try to walk a straighter line. We are all of us in need of a second chance. He had looked directly at May then, and she had felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling of being seen not as a collection of rumors, but as a person. But while some in the town offered grace, others were busy plotting, unseen by Eli or May. Caleb Wright made a quiet visit to the county surveyor, a man with a fondness for whiskey and a dislike for paperwork. A few gold coins were exchanged, and a quiet agreement was made. The surveyor would, at his earliest convenience, re-examine the Thatcher property line along the creek bed. He would discover, of course, that erosion had shifted the bank and that the original survey markers were clearly in error. A new map would be drawn, one that just happened to shift the boundary by a crucial 20 yards, placing the most valuable part of Eli's grazing land squarely on the neighboring parcel, a parcel the railroad was already in negotiations to buy. The trap was being set, its legal teeth sharpened in secret. As the days shortened and the first hints of autumn colored the air, May found a strange sense of belonging growing within her. The work was hard, but it was honest, and watching Jesse blossom was a reward she hadn't known she was seeking. One afternoon, while mending a fresh tear in Eli's heavy duster, she found herself running her fingers over the sturdy canvas. This coat had protected him from wind and rain, had been with him through long days and lonely nights. On an impulse, she took a length of dark blue thread and, on the inside lining, where no one but the wearer would ever see it, she carefully stitched two small, simple words, "Ride back home." It was a prayer in thread, a private wish for his safety. The land itself seemed determined to test their fragile new arrangement. One afternoon, a dust devil, a miniature cyclone of wind and dirt, spun out of the flatlands. It tore across the field and slammed directly into the vegetable garden. The furious vortex ripped plants from the ground and flattened the bean poles. Eli saw it first and shouted a warning. He ran from the barn, May from the house, and Jesse from the porch. Without a word, they threw themselves into the fight. Eli wrestled a section of torn canvas over the remaining tomato plants while May and Jesse worked to stake the corn stalks back up, their hands moving in a desperate, synchronized rhythm. They were a small, determined army against the indifferent violence of nature. When the whirlwind finally dissipated, they stood together, panting and covered in dirt, surveying the damage. The garden was wounded but not destroyed. In that moment, standing shoulder to shoulder against the wind, their shared effort created a bond stronger than any words. They were not just a man, a woman, and a boy. They felt like a family. But the past was never far away. That night, the memory of Kansas returned to May in a dream. She was back in that small, airless room, the air thick with the metallic scent of fear. The accusations flew at her, sharp and stinging, and she was drowning, unable to cry out. She woke up with a gasp, her heart pounding, the sheets twisted around her. The next morning, she felt fragile and exposed, the dream clinging to her like a shroud. She tried to hide it, but Eli, with his farmer's eye for subtle shifts in the weather, noticed the new tension in her shoulders, the shadows under her eyes. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not pry or offer clumsy words of comfort. Instead, as she was preparing to leave that afternoon, she found a tin cup of chamomile tea waiting for her on the porch rail, still steaming. It was a small, silent gesture, but it spoke volumes. It said, "I see you. I see you're hurt." And for the first time in a long time, May did not feel entirely alone with her ghosts. A week later, the news arrived via the telegraph, spreading through town like a prairie fire. The railroad had finalized its route. The main line would pass just east of Dry Creek, with a depot to be built on the edge of town. Suddenly, land, especially land with any potential, became the most valuable commodity in the county. The pressure on Eli, already immense, doubled overnight. His small patch of creekside grazing, the land Caleb Wright was so methodically trying to steal, was no longer just a pasture. It was a potential fortune, and a flashpoint for a war that was just beginning. The first rain of autumn came without warning. It was not a gentle shower, but a hard, percussive drumming on the sod roof. A sudden onslaught that turned the dust of the yard into a dark, greedy mud. The long drought was broken, but the relief was short-lived. That night, under the cover of the storm, Adair Pike's men paid another visit. Eli discovered the damage at dawn. Another section of fence lay in ruins, the wires snipped with contemptuous ease, but this time it was worse. The gap had been made in the far pasture. An account of the herd revealed that half a dozen yearlings were missing. They would have scattered in the storm, driven by fear, and could be miles away by now, lost in the maze of gullies and canyons that cut through the plains. Eli's face was a thundercloud, his silence more potent than any curse. He strode to the barn and began saddling his horse with grim, efficient movements. May watched him from the kitchen window, her heart sinking. The thought of him riding out alone in the treacherous, muddy conditions was unbearable. She pulled on her sturdy boots, threw a heavy shawl over her shoulders, and met him at the corral. "I'm coming with you," she said. It was not a request. Eli paused, one hand on the saddle horn. He looked at her, at the determination in her face, then at the second horse standing in the adjacent stall. He gave a short, sharp nod. "They will have headed for cover. We will check the cottonwood grove first." The search was a miserable affair. The rain had softened to a persistent, chilling drizzle that soaked them to the bone. The ground was slick, and the horses struggled for footing. They rode for hours, their eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of the missing cattle. They finally found them huddled in a small box canyon, their coats matted with mud, trembling with cold. One of the heifers was favoring a hind leg, a deep, ugly gash just above the hoof, likely from a sharp rock or a panicked scramble through thorny brush. "We cannot drive her back like this," Eli said, dismounting and approaching the injured animal slowly. "She will not make it." May slid from her own horse, her skirts heavy with mud and water. She examined the wound. It was bleeding sluggishly, but was full of dirt. It needed to be cleaned and bound. "We need a bandage," she said, looking around the barren canyon. "There was nothing?" Without a second thought, she reached under her wet wool skirt, found the hem of her linen petticoat, and, with a grunt of effort, ripped a long, wide strip from the bottom. Eli stared, his jaw slack with astonishment, as she knelt in the mud beside the nervous heifer. She dipped the cloth into a puddle of rainwater, wringing it out until it was merely damp, and began to gently clean the wound. The animal flinched but stood still, seeming to sense the compassion in May's touch. When the gash was clean, May tore another, drier strip from her ruined undergarment and wrapped it tightly around the leg, fashioning a crude but effective bandage. She stood up, wiping her muddy hands on her skirt. She was cold, wet, and bedraggled, but her face was set with a fierce satisfaction. Eli was looking at her, a strange expression on his face. It was a mixture of awe and something else, something warm and bright. A slow smile spread across his lips, crinkling the corners of his tired eyes. "Well, Miss Delaney," he said, his voice low and laced with an unfamiliar humor, "I reckon this ranch is in need of a woman like you." He paused, his gaze dropping for a moment to the tattered hem of her skirt peeking out from beneath her dress. "And your petticoat." The shared smile that passed between them was a small, warm fire in the cold, wet canyon. Their return to Dry Creek, however, was a return to a different kind of cold. News of May's continued presence at the Thatcher Ranch had been simmering on the town's gossipy hearth. And Mrs. Larkins decided it was time to stir the pot. She gathered a few of the town's more self-righteous women in her general store, forming what she grandly called a committee for the preservation of community morals. "It is not proper," she declared, her voice ringing with the authority of absolute conviction. A woman of her age, nearly 40, living in such close quarters with a widower. What are people to think it sets a terrible example? The whispers found fertile ground. The fact that May returned to her own room in town each night was a detail conveniently ignored. The story was much more scandalous without it. The social temperature in Dry Creek dropped several degrees for May. Women who had previously offered a polite nod now looked straight through her. Conversations would halt when she entered a room. She was an outsider again, the object of suspicion and scorn. The situation was made infinitely worse by the cold, impartial cruelty of technology. A man in town who had once lived near May's old home in Kansas received a telegraph message from his cousin. The cousin, prompted by an inquiry, was happy to recount the entire sordid, inaccurate story of the difficult birth. The clicking message that came over the wire was stripped of all nuance and compassion. It was a stark, black and white condemnation. Midwife Delaney involved in infant death, blamed for negligence. The telegraph operator, a young man with a love for drama, did not keep the contents of the message to himself. Within a day, the words were everywhere, carrying the unimpeachable authority of a message sent by lightning. It was no longer a rumor. It was a fact, delivered by the modern marvel of the age. The weight of it all pressed down on May, a physical ache in her chest, the old impulse to flee, to pack her basket and disappear into the vastness of the West, rose up, stronger than ever. She could leave. She could spare Eli the embarrassment and the trouble. She could find another town, another place to be quiet and unnoticed. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed in her small room, her sewing basket at her feet, and seriously contemplated escape. Then she thought of Jesse. She pictured his solemn face, the slow dawn of a smile when he finally mastered a difficult word, the way his small hand clutched the handkerchief she had lost. He had started talking more, filling the silence of the ranch with his hesitant questions and observations. If she left, that silence might descend again, heavier than before. To run would be to abandon the boy as surely as she was abandoning Eli. She stood up and unpacked the few items she had mentally packed away. She would not run, not this time. She was staying to fight, not for her own reputation, but for the fragile peace of a small, grieving boy. Help came from an unexpected quarter. The following Sunday, May went to church, her head held high, expecting to be met with a wall of cold shoulders. Instead, after the service, as Mrs. Larkins and her committee were pointedly ignoring her, Reverend Howell made his way directly to her side. "Miss Delaney," he said, his voice warm and clear for all to hear. "I was so pleased to hear that young Jesse Thatcher is learning to read. A mind is a garden, and you are planting the seeds of knowledge." Before May could stammer a reply, another voice joined them, sharp and accented. "And she makes a pozole that would make my own grandmother weep with joy." It was Alma Ruiz, the proprietor of the small but popular Mexican eatery. She was a formidable woman with laughing eyes and a spine of steel. She placed a hand on May's arm. A woman who can teach a child and season a stew is a treasure in a place like this. Those who say otherwise have sour soup for souls. She glared directly at Mrs. Larkins, who had the decency to look flustered. The public endorsement from two of the town's most respected, if very different, figures was a powerful counterstrike. It did not silence the whispers, but it robbed them of their absolute power. It showed the town that there was more than one verdict possible. That afternoon, back at the ranch, a strange sequence of events unfolded. May was tidying the porch, intending to clean the makeshift blackboard. The original crate it had been made from was still leaning against the house, along with some other discarded wood. Tucked inside the crate was a bundle of old, leather-bound ledgers and survey books, left behind by Eli's father. May had glanced through them once before, fascinated by the old-fashioned script. Now, intending to use one of the books to press some autumn leaves with Jessie, she picked one up and opened it. It was a survey book from 20 years prior. As she idly flipped the stiff pages, her eyes caught on a map of the Thatcher property. She traced the line of the creek bed with her finger. Then she saw it. On the page detailing the western boundary, the measurements were written in a neat, faded pencil script, but on the facing page, where the details of the creek itself were noted, a few key numbers had been written in a slightly different hand, with a harder, darker pencil. It was a subtle difference, one that only a seamstress accustomed to noticing the tiniest variations in thread and stitch would likely detect. She felt a prickle of unease. It looked as if someone had altered the record. The rain started again as she was preparing to leave, a steady, determined downpour. Eli would not hear of her walking back in the storm. "You will ride with me," he said. "I have business in town anyway." The ride back was unlike any she had ever taken. She sat behind him on his big bay horse, her hands resting lightly on his waist for balance. The steady rhythm of the horse's gait, the warmth of his back against her front, the broad brim of his hat shielding her from the worst of the rain, it all created a small, intimate world for the two of them, a moving shelter against the storm. The forced proximity broke down the last of their reserve. "I am sorry for the trouble my staying has caused you," she said, her voice quiet against the drumming of the rain. He was silent for a long moment. "The trouble was here long before you, May. You have just brought it into the light." He shifted in the saddle. "After Eleanor passed," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I think I went away for a while. My body was here, doing the work, but my spirit, it was hiding in silence. It was not fair to the boy." He took a deep breath. "You are teaching him to use his voice again, and maybe you are teaching me, too." His confession was a gift, an offering of trust that left her breathless. She found herself telling him about Kansas, not the whispered, ugly version, but the truth of her fear and her helplessness. He listened without judgment, his body a solid, reassuring presence in front of her. When they arrived at her small room, he helped her down from the horse. For a moment, they stood under the narrow overhang of the mercantile, the rain sluicing down around them. That night, when he returned to the ranch, he lit the hurricane lamp on the porch as always. The wind howled, and the rain beat against the house, but the flame inside the glass chimney did not gutter. It held steady, burning with a bright, unwavering light. May, from her window in town, could not see it, but she felt a similar flame kindle within her own heart. Perhaps, she thought, a small smile touching her lips. "I am not done dreaming after all." She did not know that, at that very moment, Caleb Wright was in his office at the bank, looking out at the rain-swept street. He had seen her earlier that day, sitting on the Thatcher porch with the old survey ledger in her lap. An unpleasant suspicion had begun to form in his mind. He walked over to his safe, pulled out a newer, official-looking document, and examined it under the lamplight. It was the fraudulent survey, recently stamped and approved by the county clerk. He would need to file it officially, and soon. The seamstress was proving to be more troublesome than he had anticipated. The arrival of the medical delegation was an event in Dry Creek, a special carriage, chartered by the railroad and considerably plusher than the daily stage, deposited 3 soberly dressed men in front of the town's only hotel. They were on a tour of the territory, assessing the need for more permanent doctors in the rapidly expanding settlements. For most of the town, it was a curiosity. For May Delaney, it was the unforeseen arrival of a ghost from a past she had thought long buried. She saw him from across the street. He was older, grayer, and his shoulders were stooped with a weariness that went beyond the dust of the road. But she knew him instantly. It was Dr. Merritt, the man who had presided over the birth in Kansas, the one who had stood by in stunned silence as the blame settled on her shoulders. A wave of nausea and cold fear washed over her. She turned and fled into the relative anonymity of the general store, her heart hammering against her ribs. She busied herself examining a bolt of calico, her hands trembling so badly she could barely feel the texture of the cloth. She hoped he had not seen her, that he would conduct his business and be gone before their paths could cross. But the jingle of the bell over the door a few minutes later told her it was a futile hope. "Excuse me, ma'am," a familiar voice said from behind her. May froze, her back rigid. Mrs. Larkins, sensing a brewing drama, stopped polishing the counter and watched with undisguised interest. "I am looking for a woman named May Delaney," Dr. Merritt continued, his voice heavy with contrition. "I was told she might be here." Slowly, May turned to face him. His eyes, though tired, were clear and direct. They held no malice, only a deep, abiding regret. "I am May Delaney," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. Relief and pain warred on the doctor's face. "I have been hoping to find you for 3 years, he said, his voice dropping so that only she and the avid Mrs. Larkins could hear. "I have come to make a thing right." He opened the worn leather satchel he was carrying and pulled out a thick, ledger-style book, a medical journal. He opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "The birth of the Miller child," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I wrote it all down that night. My hands were shaking then, too." He held the book out for her to see, though she could not bring herself to look at the spidery script. "It was not your fault. Miss Delaney, it was never your fault. The forceps, there was a flaw in the steel, a hairline fracture. They failed at the critical moment. I was too proud and too shocked to admit that my own instruments, my own judgment in using them, had failed. It was easier to let the whispers fall on you." The confession hung in the air of the general store, thick and heavy. May felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. For years, she had carried the weight of a failure that was not her own, a burden of shame that had shaped the very course of her life. To have it lifted so suddenly, so publicly, was a dizzying, disorienting shock. "I have written a letter to the medical board," Dr. Merritt said, his voice thick with emotion, "and I will say so to anyone in this town who will listen. I am profoundly sorry for the injustice you have suffered because of my cowardice." Mrs. Larkins, who had been listening with rapt attention, sniffed loudly. The apology had ruined her neat narrative of May's unsuitability, but she was a master of shifting her ground. "Well," she declared to the room at large, "right or wrong back then does not change what is proper now. The situation at the Thatcher Ranch remains a matter of public concern." She had conceded the battle over the past only to immediately resume the war over the present. But for May, everything had changed. The vindication was a powerful tonic. The shame she had carried for so long dissolved, and in its place, a new, unfamiliar strength began to take root. She was no longer a woman hiding from her past. She looked Dr. Merritt in the eye, a silent acknowledgement of his apology passing between them. Then, with a new sense of purpose, she walked out of the store, leaving the whispers and the judgments behind her. Her first stop was the small church, where she found Reverend Howell tending his small garden. She did not speak of the doctor or of Kansas. Instead, she told him about the altered survey ledger she had found, about her suspicions regarding Caleb Wright and the Thatcher property line. The Reverend listened intently, his brow furrowed in thought. "An accusation of this gravity requires more than suspicion, my dear," he said. "But it certainly warrants investigation. The county records office keeps all the original land grants. It is a long ride, but it is the only place to find the truth." Emboldened, May felt a surge of determination. She would not let Eli be cheated. She would fight. But their enemies were not idle. That very afternoon, Caleb Wright, having heard of the doctor's public apology and sensing that May's standing in the community might be shifting, decided to act. He rode his buggy to the county seat and officially filed the new, fraudulent survey map. It was now a legal document, stamped and recorded. At the same time, Adair Pike took a more direct approach. On the pretext of moving a portion of her herd to new grazing, she had her men drive 100 head of cattle back and forth across the narrowest part of the dry creek bed on Eli's property. The sharp hooves of the cattle churned the banks into a muddy ruin, collapsing the edges and artificially widening the channel. The land itself was being tortured to match the lie on Caleb Wright's map. The emotional toll of these maneuverings landed hardest on the smallest member of the Thatcher household. That evening, hiding just outside the kitchen window, Jesse heard Eli and May talking in low, worried tones. He did not understand the words about surveys and banknotes, but he understood the core of it. He heard the phrase "sell the land," and his world tilted on its axis. Selling the land meant losing his home, the only home he had ever known, the place where the ghost of his mother's songs still lingered in the leaves of the chestnut tree. The primal fear of a child who has already lost too much overwhelmed him. He did not cry out. He simply slipped away from the house, his small face a mask of silent terror. His gaze went to the familiar ridgeline, and he began to walk, following the unseen trail of the only other creature he knew who seemed as wild and lonely as he felt Silvergal. An hour later, May noticed his absence. A quick search of the house and barn turned up nothing. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in as she and Eli stood on the porch, their calls of his name swallowed by the vast, empty landscape. The sky began to change. The setting sun was choked by a mass of dark, bruised purple clouds rolling in from the mountains. The air grew still and heavy, and a sudden, unnatural chill fell over the land. A mountain thunderstorm was about to break. "He loves that wild mare," Eli said, his voice strained, his eyes scanning the hills. He would have gone that way. They saddled the horses and rode out, splitting up to cover more ground. May urged her horse toward the series of rocky outcrops where she had often seen Silvergal. The first drops of rain, large and cold, began to fall. The wind rose with a sudden, violent shriek, and the sky opened. It was not rain, but a driving horizontal sleet that stung her face and reduced visibility to a few yards. She found him on a high, exposed ledge, huddled in the lee of a large boulder. He was soaked and shivering, his face pale with cold and fear. The gully below them, a dry wash an hour ago, was now a churning, fast-moving torrent of brown water. "Jesse!" she cried, relief and fear warring in her voice as she slid from her horse. She scrambled across the slick rock toward him. He looked up, his eyes wide with terror. They were trapped. The way back was blocked by a newly formed channel, too wide to jump. As she watched, a section of the rock under her feet crumbled and fell into the torrent. The ledge was unstable. "We have to cross now," she said, her voice calm and steady despite the frantic beating of her own heart. She looked at the gap, then at the terrified boy. There was only one way. Bracing herself against the rock wall, she lowered herself into the gap, her feet finding precarious purchase on the submerged rocks below. She stretched her body across the channel, her hands gripping the rock on the other side. "Climb over me." "Jesse," she ordered. "Use my back as a bridge. Do not look down. Just come to me." He hesitated, his small body trembling violently. Then, seeing the absolute certainty in her eyes, he did as he was told. He scrambled onto her back, his small, cold hands clutching her shoulders, his boots slipping on her wet shawl. For a terrifying moment, she felt her own strength failing, her muscles screaming in protest. Then he was across, safe on the other side. Just as she was trying to pull herself up, a strong hand clamped around her arm. It was Eli. He had seen them from a lower trail and had fought his way up the treacherous slope. With a powerful heave, he pulled her from the gully and onto the solid ground beside the boy. For a long moment, the three of them simply clung to each other, a small, desperate knot of humanity against the fury of the storm. Eli's arms were around both of them, holding them tight, his face buried in Jesse's wet hair. The rain and sleet beat down on them, but inside that circle, there was a fierce, protective warmth. They were a family, forged in that moment of shared terror and ultimate relief. The storm passed as quickly as it had come. The journey back to the ranch was a long, silent affair. May was shaking uncontrollably now, a deep, bone-rattling chill that had nothing to do with the cold. When they reached the house, Eli lifted a near-sleeping Jesse from the saddle and carried him inside. May started to follow, but her legs felt unsteady. Eli returned a moment later, carrying his heavy canvas duster, the one she had mended. He draped it over her trembling shoulders, its familiar weight a comfort, its lining still holding a trace of his own warmth. He stood before her, his hands on her shoulders, his clear blue eyes searching her face in the gathering dusk. "You saved him," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she could not name. He took a deep breath. "Do not give up again. May, not on us." The plea was simple, direct, and it struck a chord deep inside her. He was not just talking about the storm. He was talking about Kansas, about running, about hiding. He was asking her to stay. Before she could answer, a sound carried on the clean-washed air from the direction of the high ridge, the clear, ringing whinny of a wild horse. From the doorway, where he stood wrapped in a blanket, Jesse's small voice drifted out to them. "She did not give up," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "Like you, Miss May." The storm had scrubbed the world clean. The air that drifted through the open kitchen door was cool and smelled of wet earth and sage. A clean, sharp scent that felt like a new beginning. Inside, a different kind of warmth held sway. A pan of cornbread, baked earlier by May, sat cooling on the stove, filling the room with its comforting, wholesome aroma. The long day of fear and desperation had finally caught up with Jesse. He had fallen asleep at the kitchen table, his head pillowed on his arms, his small face peaceful in the soft, amber light of the hurricane lamp. The lamp sat in the center of the table, its flame burning with a calm, steady intensity that seemed to defy the memory of the storm. It cast a golden glow on Jesse's dark hair and traced the lines of exhaustion and relief on May's face as she sat watching him, a half-empty cup of tea grown cold in her hands. The house was quiet, wrapped in a profound peace that felt earned, precious. Eli sat across from her, his large frame slumped in his chair, his usual stoicism worn away by the day's events. He stared into the lamp's flame, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. For a long time, the only sounds were the soft ticking of the mantel clock and the boy's even breathing. "This house has not felt this way in a long time," Eli said finally, his voice a low rumble that did not disturb the quiet. He did not look at her, but his words were aimed directly at her heart. "After Eleanor died, the silence, it was a physical thing. It had weight. I could feel it pressing down on me, on the boy. The whole place felt empty. Not just quiet, but hollowed out. A shell." He finally raised his eyes to meet hers, and she saw in their blue depths a raw vulnerability she had never seen before. "I tried to fill it with work, woke before dawn, worked until I could not stand, fell into bed too tired to think, but the hollowness was always there, waiting, especially at night." He gestured with his chin toward his sleeping son. He felt it, too. He just went inside himself to get away from it. I did not know how to bring him back. May's heart ached for him, for the profound loneliness he described. It was a mirror to her own, though hers had been a different kind of empty room. I know what it is to be afraid of a reputation, she confessed, her voice soft. To feel like a story someone else wrote is following you around, and you cannot outrun it. For years, I have tried to make myself smaller, quieter. I thought if I did not draw any attention, the story would eventually fade, but it never does. It just waits for a new voice to tell it. She thought of Dr. Merritt's confession in the general store. The sudden, shocking lifting of a burden she had carried until it felt like a part of her own bones. I spent so long being ashamed of something I did not do that I think I forgot who I was supposed to be. I was just the woman from Kansas. Eli leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table, the lamplight carving his earnest face from the shadows. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His touch was warm, solid, a grounding force. "They talk in town," he said, his voice slow and deliberate, each word chosen with care. "I hear the whispers. Mrs. Larkins and her kind." He paused, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "They said she was too old to dream." The words, the same ones she'd overheard that first day, struck her with the force of a physical blow. But hearing them from him, they sounded different, not like an insult, but like a challenge. "They said she was too old to dream," he repeated, his gaze holding hers, intense and unwavering, until the widowed rancher asked her to start anew. He squeezed her hand gently. "I'm here, May. I'm asking you that." It was not a proposal of marriage in the traditional sense. It was something far deeper, far more terrifying and beautiful. He was not offering her a ring or a new name. He was offering her a chance to reclaim a life, to build something new from the wreckage of their pasts. He was offering her a home, not just a house, but a place to belong. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and surprising. They were not tears of sadness, but of a profound, earth-shaking relief. She could not speak. She could only nod, a small, jerky movement, a slow smile. The first genuine, unguarded smile she had seen from him transformed his face, erasing the lines of grief and worry. Later, after he had carried a still-sleeping Jessie to his bed, they stood together on the porch. The rain had stopped completely, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening under a sliver of moon. The air was cool on their faces. The silence between them was no longer awkward or heavy, but filled with a comfortable, unspoken understanding. He turned to her, and in the pale moonlight, he gently cupped her face in his hands. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a fiery, passionate kiss, but one of tenderness and profound gratitude. It was a kiss of shared sorrows and newfound hope, a quiet promise sealed in the peaceful aftermath of the storm. It was the kiss of a man and a woman who had decided to stand together, not just for themselves, but for the future sleeping inside the house. "We will not have a wedding day," he said against her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "Not yet. First, we fight. We fight for this home." "Yes," she whispered, her voice finding its strength. "We fight, but we have to win the right way. Eli, with the truth." A sense of purpose, clean and sharp, cut through the emotional haze of the evening. They went back inside and sat at the kitchen table, the lamp still burning brightly between them. A new energy sparked in the room, the energy of a partnership forged and ready for battle. Eli let out a long breath, a hint of his earlier humor returning. "Well," he said, running a hand through his hair, "if we lose this place, at least I have finally learned to cook a pot of beans without turning them into library paste." May laughed, a genuine, bubbling sound of pure joy that felt foreign and wonderful in her own throat. "I would call that social progress, Mr. Thatcher," she said, her eyes sparkling. "A significant step forward for civilization on these plains." The levity felt good, a necessary release after the intensity of the day. Their laughter faded into a comfortable, productive silence as they began to plan. "The ledger I found," May said, her mind suddenly sharp. "The one with the altered numbers. It is a start, but it is not proof. We need something more solid." "My father," Eli said, a distant look in his eyes. "He used to talk about the original survey. When he first claimed this land, he set a boundary marker himself. He did not trust the wooden stakes the territory surveyors used. He found a big flat piece of granite down by the creek and spent a week carving his brand into it with a hammer and chisel." "What was the brand?" May asked, leaning forward eagerly. "A steer's head," Eli said, "with long, curved horns. He was very proud of it. He said that stone would be here long after he was gone, a permanent witness." "Then that is what we have to find," May said, her voice ringing with a new conviction. "We find that stone, and we expose Caleb Wright's lie for what it is." They began to tick off their assets, their allies. "Alma Ruiz," May said. "She grew up here. She might remember something." "And Dr. Merritt," Eli added. "He is a respected man. If he would be willing to speak to my character, to your character, it would carry weight. It would show the town we are not the sort of people who would lie about a thing like this." The path forward was still fraught with danger, but for the first time, it seemed possible. They had a plan, they had allies, they had each other. As the hour grew late, Eli stood up and went to a large wooden chest in the corner of the main room. He knelt and opened it, the scent of old leather and cedar filling the air. He rummaged for a moment before pulling out a set of reins. They were made of a soft, dark leather, beautifully braided, with small silver conchos. They were clearly old, but had been meticulously cared for. They were a woman's reins, light and fine. He brought them back to the table and laid them in front of May. "These were Eleanor's," he said softly. "She was the only one who ever came close to gentling that silver mare. She had a touch with wild things." He looked at May, his expression deeply serious. "Silver Gal seems to trust you. She watches you, if you ever get the chance, if she ever lets you get close. I want you to have these." He pushed the reins toward her. "Freedom," he said, his voice thick with meaning. "Need someone who understands it." May picked up the reins. The soft, supple leather, a tangible link to the past, and now a symbol of the future. It was an act of profound trust, an offering of a memory that was precious and painful, and it moved her more than any words could say. When she finally left for her room in town, Eli stood on the porch and watched her go. The hurricane lamp was still on the kitchen table, its chimney clean, its reservoir full. It burned with a steady, unwavering light, a small, bright beacon in the vast darkness of the plains. It was as if the house itself, no longer hollow, had finally given its quiet nod of approval. The hunt for the marker stone began at first light. The three of them, Eli, May, and Jesse, moved with a quiet, shared purpose. A small family on a quest. They started where the creek bed was most defined, following its serpentine path through the Thatcher land. Eli led, his eyes scanning the banks, looking for any unnatural formation, any rock large enough to fit his father's description. Jesse, his small legs working hard to keep up, pointed out interesting stones and animal tracks, his earlier fear replaced by a boy's sense of grand adventure. It was May, however, who noticed the clue. Her gaze was not fixed on the rocks, but on the life that grew around them. She had a seamstress's eye for pattern, for the way things ought to lie, and something was amiss. Along a flat, wide section of the bank, a stand of old cottonwoods grew, their roots thick and gnarled, but one tree's roots, instead of spreading evenly, seemed to curve in a distinct, unnatural arc, as if avoiding something buried just beneath the surface. More telling, the soil around the base of that tree was looser, darker, and held a smattering of younger, opportunistic weeds that had not yet taken hold elsewhere. "Eli," she said softly, stopping and pointing. "Look there." The ground has been disturbed. Recently. He came to her side, his gaze following her finger. He knelt, scooping up a handful of the dark soil. He crumbled it between his fingers, his expression thoughtful. "You are right," he said. "This is topsoil from further downstream. It is silt. This whole section has been built up." He looked from the curved roots to the churned-up bank where Adair Pike's cattle had done their work. They covered it. They tried to bury the evidence. Excitement, sharp and electric, shot through them. Grabbing a spade from his saddle, Eli began to dig. The work was slow at first, the new layer of soil soft and deep. But then, with a dull thud, the spade struck something solid. Eli's movements became more urgent, more focused. He cleared the soil away, and slowly, an expanse of flat, gray stone was revealed. And there, in the center, weathered by decades of sun and flood, but still perfectly clear, was the unmistakable carving of a steer's head, its long horns sweeping outward in a proud, possessive curve. A choked cry of triumph escaped Eli's lips. Jesse stared, his eyes wide with wonder, and reached out a small, hesitant hand to trace the lines of the carving. It was real, the witness of stone, just as his grandfather had promised. "We have it," May breathed, a wave of relief so profound it made her feel lightheaded. "We have our proof." But they had no time to celebrate. From his pocket, Eli produced a nub of charcoal and a clean sheet of paper. "A rubbing," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "We need a copy we can take with us." He knelt and began to work, carefully rubbing the charcoal over the paper he had laid across the stone, the image of the brand emerging like a ghost on the white surface. They were so focused on their task that they did not hear the riders until they were almost upon them. 4 men, their faces hard and unfamiliar, reined in their horses at the edge of the creek bed. They were not cattlemen, they were town men, hired muscle who worked for whoever paid the highest wage. One of them, a burly man with a florid face, dismounted. "This is private property you are trespassing on." "Thatcher," the man said, his voice a gravelly sneer. "This is my property," Eli retorted, rising to his full height, the finished rubbing clutched in his hand. "And this stone proves it." The man laughed. A short, ugly sound. "That stone does not prove anything. We have a legally filed order from the county clerk, verifying the new survey lines." He produced a folded document from his coat. "You and your companions are to vacate this area immediately." Before Eli could argue, another sound filled the air, a low rumble that grew into a thunderous roar. From over the rise, a wave of brown and white appeared, a portion of Adair Pike's herd, driven hard by a half-dozen of her riders. They were heading directly for the creek bed. "No," May cried, realizing their intent. But it was too late. The cattle poured into the shallow channel, their hooves churning the soft, disturbed earth into a muddy soup. They trampled over the exposed marker stone, their immense weight driving it deeper into the mire, burying it once more, this time under a violent chaos of mud and water. The site was obliterated, the truth deliberately, brutally erased. Eli stood frozen, his face a mask of helpless fury, the charcoal rubbing in his hand seeming flimsy and insignificant against the brute force arrayed against them. Just as despair began to settle, a new rider appeared on the ridge. It was Reverend Howell, his black coat flapping behind him as he urged his horse forward. And behind him, another figure, and another. A small procession of buggies, wagons, and saddle horses was making its way from town. The Reverend had acted quickly, spreading the word, calling not on the law, but on the conscience of the community. Within minutes, the creek bed was lined with the citizens of Dry Creek. Alma Ruiz was there, her arms crossed, her dark eyes missing nothing. Dr. Merritt, his face grim, stood beside her. Tom and Mary, the young couple whose baby May had helped deliver, were there, their faces filled with worry. Even a few of Mrs. Larkin's moral committee had come. their curiosity overpowering their judgment. Reverend Howell dismounted and walked to the center of the chaotic scene, his presence radiating a calm authority that silenced the nervous chatter. "It seems there is a disagreement about a property line," he announced, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet. "A matter for the law, to be sure, but until the county magistrate can come and see for himself, a matter for our own eyes. Let it be noted, by all of us here, that on this day, the Thatcher family did uncover a carved boundary marker at this location." He turned to Pike's men, who had halted their cattle, their expressions sullen and uncertain. "And let it also be noted that this site was then deliberately destroyed." It was a brilliant stroke of what he later called folk jurisprudence. He was creating a public record, a sworn testimony of dozens of witnesses that would be impossible to deny. Caleb Wright himself arrived then, his buggy rattling to a halt. His face was a mask of cold fury as he took in the scene. He saw his hired men thwarted, his plan exposed to the entire town. His eyes fell on May, standing beside Eli, and his anger found its target. He strode toward her, his voice dripping with condescension. Well, the meddling seamstress, not content to interfere with matters of medicine. Now you are an expert in land surveys. A woman of your age and reputation should learn to attend to her own small business." The insult was designed to shame her, to remind everyone of the old whispers. But the woman who faced him was not the same woman who had fled from Kansas. She stood her ground, her chin held high, her gaze steady and unafraid. "Any age, Mr. Right," she said, her voice clear and ringing, "knows the difference between right and wrong." The simple, powerful truth of her words silenced him. Before he could retort, Alma Ruiz stepped forward. "My father used to tell me stories," she said, her voice rich with the cadence of her heritage. "Stories of when the Anglos first came to this valley. He told me how the boundary markers for the old Mexican land grants, markers that had stood for generations, would sometimes move. A fence would be shifted in the night. A riverbank would suddenly erode. This is an old story here. It seems some people are still telling it." Her words created a powerful connection, linking Eli's struggle to a longer history of injustice. It was no longer just about one man's land. It was about the integrity of the entire community. May knew they had to press their advantage. While the town was assembled, while the memory was fresh, they had to make their move official. Leaving Eli and the Reverend to take written statements from the witnesses, she rode hard for town. At the telegraph office, she took out the charcoal rubbing, now slightly smeared but still legible, and the piece of paper on which Jesse had been drawing earlier. The boy, with the simple, heartbreaking clarity of a child, had drawn a map. It showed the creek, the house, the big chestnut tree, and the place where they had found the stone. And it showed a line of angry, jagged marks where the bank had been destroyed by the cattle. It was a child's drawing, but it was also a perfect, irrefutable piece of evidence of the destruction. She handed both papers to the telegraph operator. "I need you to send a message to the county records office," she said, her voice firm. "Describe this rubbing in as much detail as you can. Describe this map. Tell them we are challenging the survey filed by Mr. Caleb Wright, and that we have 24 witnesses to the discovery and subsequent destruction of the original boundary marker." The operator, whose taste for drama was now fully engaged on the side of justice, began to tap out the message with furious speed, sending their truth down the wire to lodge itself in the official record before Caleb Wright's paper lie could fully take root. That evening, a profound quiet settled over the Thatcher ranch. The day had been a whirlwind of confrontation and raw emotion. Now, there was nothing to do but wait. The telegraph had come back with a reply a county magistrate would arrive in the morning to investigate the claim. May and Eli sat on the top rail of the corral fence, not speaking. Jesse sat between them, leaning his head sleepily against his father's side. The long day had exhausted them all. A comfortable, full silence rested between them. The bond they had forged through shared struggle had deepened into something as solid and dependable as the earth beneath their feet. It no longer needed words. May felt Eli's shoulder press against hers, a simple, reassuring touch that spoke of partnership, of trust, of home. As darkness fell, a cool breeze began to stir from the east, a reversal of the usual westerly wind. It rustled the leaves of the cottonwoods and carried with it the scent of distant rain. The wind had shifted. The final storm was coming. The night did not settle. It descended. The east wind, a stranger to this land, carried a palpable tension. It was a dry, fretful wind that whispered of trouble, rattling the loose pane in the kitchen window and making the horses shift uneasily in their stalls. Eli, sensing the wrongness in the air, had checked the latches on the barn doors twice. May, feeling the atmospheric pressure in her bones, had built up the fire in the stove, a small act of domestic defiance against the brooding sky. The first sign was not a sight, but a smell. A sharp, acrid scent of wood smoke, too close and too hungry to be from a neighbor's hearth, cut through the clean scent of the coming rain. Eli was on his feet in an instant, his face a mask of grim understanding. He threw open the door, and the sight that met them was a vision from a nightmare. An unnatural orange light pulsed against the dark underbelly of the clouds. The far corner of the barn, the section used for storing hay, was engulfed in flames. The wind, that traitorous east wind, was fanning the blaze, pushing it hungrily toward the main structure, toward the terrified animals trapped inside. For a heartbeat, they were frozen, paralyzed by the sheer malice of the act. Then, as the first roar of the fire reached them, a sound like a great beast awakening, they broke into motion, their actions driven by pure, desperate instinct. The animals, Eli yelled, grabbing a heavy axe from beside the door. "I will break the main gate." Just as he spoke, the world was rent by a second, entirely different sound. A sudden, deafening clatter, as if a giant had thrown a handful of rocks against the tin roof of the porch. Then another, and another. The sky, which had threatened rain, unleashed a fusillade of ice. Hail, hard and white and the size of marbles, began to hammer the dry earth, a sudden, violent counterpoint to the fire. Nature was at war with itself, and the Thatcher Ranch was the battlefield. The scene descended into a primal chaos of warring elements. The fire roared, casting a hellish, dancing light. The hail hammered down, a relentless, percussive assault, hissing and exploding into steam where it struck the burning timbers. Eli raced toward the main corral, the axe in his hand, his goal to free the horses before the fire could trap them. May, her mind racing, knew the cattle, panicked by the fire and the noise, would stampede, trampling each other in their terror. She ran toward the smaller holding pen near the barn, her shawl pulled over her head against the stinging ice. She did not shout. Instead, she began to whistle, a low, steady, trilling note that she had used to calm Jessie. It was a sound of peace in the midst of pandemonium. The nearest cows, their eyes wide with terror, turned their heads toward the sound, their panic momentarily arrested by the strange, calm note. Jessie May screamed over her shoulder toward the house. "The lantern, run to the Miller place. Bring help." The boy appeared in the doorway, his small face illuminated by the terrible light, his eyes huge. For a second, he looked paralyzed by the horror. Then he saw his father fighting with the corral gate, his mother walking calmly toward a wall of fire, and a new resolve hardened his features. He darted back inside, emerging a moment later with a hurricane lamp, its flame a tiny, brave spark in the maelstrom. Clutching it tightly, he ran, a small, desperate Paul Revere, his feet slipping in the mud and ice as he disappeared into the stormy darkness. May reached the gate to the pen. She worked the latch with trembling fingers and swung it open. She kept whistling, her tune unwavering, and began to walk away from the fire, toward the safety of the open pasture. One cow, then another, then the whole small herd followed the sound. a river of brown and white flowing away from destruction, guided by a single thread of music. Eli, having shattered the lock on the main corral, was now using his brute strength to drag the heavy watering trough away from the barn, hoping to create a firebreak. He was a silhouette of furious effort against the flames. As he worked, a new figure appeared at the edge of the firelight, a man on horseback, watching. It was Caleb Wright. He was not there to help. He was there to witness the final act of his victory. May, having led the cattle to safety, turned back and saw him. A cold, clarifying rage burned through her fear. She marched toward him, the hail bouncing off her shoulders, her face streaked with soot and fury. She stopped directly in front of his horse, forcing the animal to dance backward. "You did this," she said, her voice low and shaking with an intensity that made it more powerful than a shout. Caleb looked down at her, a smug, contemptuous smile on his face. "I have no idea what you are talking about, woman. It seems your friend Thatcher has been careless with a lantern." "This has nothing to do with carelessness," May said, her voice rising now, ringing with the force of absolute conviction. "You did not burn a barn. You burned trust. You burned a man's home, his future, all for a few feet of dirt." The accusation, so direct, so public, seemed to rattle him. His smile faltered. "This is not just a few feet of dirt," he sneered, his arrogance overriding his caution. "This is prime land for the new railroad spur. A man has to be practical." He had admitted it. The slip of the tongue, the casual confession of his motive, hung in the air between them, more damning than any physical evidence. As he spoke, a flicker of movement near the burning hayrick caught the Reverend Howell's eye. He and Alma Ruiz, alerted by a breathless Jesse, had just arrived. They saw one of Adair Pike's men, who had been tasked with starting the fire, stumbling away in the confusion. As he scrambled over a low fence, something fell from his belt, a dark object that landed with a soft thud in the mud. The man, panicked, did not notice. Alma and the Reverend exchanged a look and moved toward the spot. Alma reached down and picked it up. It was a knife, heavy and well made, and carved into its wooden hilt was the fierce, predatory bird of Adair Pike's brand. The final link in the chain of conspiracy lay in her hand. Just then, a buggy, its lamps cutting through the sheets of hail, pulled into the yard at a reckless pace. A man in a heavy coat and a brimmed hat jumped down. "What in the name of creation is going on here?" he bellowed. It was the county magistrate, a day early, drawn by the pillar of fire and smoke visible for miles. He stood in the center of the yard. A figure of the law dropped into a scene of utter chaos. A barn was burning to the ground. Ice was falling from the sky. A herd of cattle was scattered across a pasture, and the entire community of Dry Creek, it seemed, was standing in the mud, watching. May walked toward him, her purpose clear. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying over the din, "my name is May Delaney. This is the culmination of a criminal conspiracy to defraud Mr. Eli Thatcher of his land." One by one, she presented her case, there in the muddy, fire-lit, ice-pelted courtroom of the Thatcher Ranch. She produced the charcoal rubbing of the marker stone. She showed him Jesse's childish, heartbreaking map of the destroyed creek bank. Dr. Merritt stepped forward, his medical journal in hand, not to speak of land, but to offer a solemn, powerful testimony to May's unimpeachable character. The telegraph operator, who had ridden out with the others, presented a copy of the message he had sent to the magistrate's own office, its timestamp proving their claim had been made before the fire had ever been set. Finally, Alma Ruiz stepped forward and held up the knife. The magistrate looked from the evidence to Caleb Wright's pale, sweat-streaked face, then to Adair Pike, who had just ridden up and was taking in the scene with a look of dawning horror. "I am placing a temporary injunction on any transfer of this property's deed," the magistrate declared, his voice booming. "The original boundary, as indicated by this evidence, will be provisionally restored pending a full investigation. Mr. Wright," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm, for suspicion of fraud, conspiracy, and arson. You are hereby in my custody. The fight was over. The victory was absolute. In the midst of the swirling chaos, as two deputies led a stunned Caleb Wright to the buggy, Eli moved to May's side. The hail had lessened slightly. The stones, now the size of white beans, coating the ground in a layer of shimmering ice. The roar of the fire was dying as the heart of the blaze was drowned by the relentless storm. He turned to her, his face illuminated by the fire's last, gasping light. There were no words of thanks, no grand pronouncements. He simply looked at her, his heart in his eyes, and said, his voice so low that only she could hear, "The house! Has someone to light the fire now?" At the edge of the property, Adair Pike took in the scene Caleb being arrested, his men deserting him, the magistrate standing like a pillar of judgment in the center of it all. A cold, pragmatic calculation moved across his features. He had lost. Without a word, he wheeled his horse around and melted back into the stormy darkness, leaving his few remaining men standing confused and alone in the hail, a pack of defeated wolves. The fire was guttering now, a smoking, steaming ruin. The hail softened to a cold, steady rain. In the midst of the devastation, a small, unwavering light moved toward them. It was Jesse, the hurricane lamp still held securely in his hand, its flame miraculously intact. A tiny beacon of hope that had not been extinguished by the wind or the fire or the storm. The fight was done. The rain began to wash the soot from the air. The ground was a mess of charred wood, mud, and melting ice, but on the porch, untouched by the chaos. A kettle May had left on the small outdoor stove began to whistle, its cheerful, domestic sound a promise of the quiet, ordinary life that they had just won back. In the days that followed the fire and the hail, a profound quiet settled over Dry Creek, the kind of quiet that follows a fever breaking. The town, having been a spectator to a battle of wills, seemed to exhale a collective sigh of relief. The drama was over, and the slow work of healing could begin. The change was most palpable in the small, everyday interactions. 2 days after the magistrate had taken Caleb Wright into custody, May was on the porch of the Thatcher house, sorting through salvaged tools from the ruined barn, when she saw a familiar, stout figure walking determinedly up the path from town. It was Mrs. Larkins. She carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth, and her face was set in an expression of grim purpose. May's first instinct was to brace herself for another confrontation, but she held her ground, wiping her sooty hands on her apron. Mrs. Larkins did not seem to know what to do with her hands or her eyes. She stopped a few feet from the porch, her gaze fixed on a spot somewhere near May's left shoulder. "I was baking," she announced to the empty air, "and I made too much." She thrust the basket forward. "It is a plum cake, for the boy. All that excitement is not good for a child's digestion. He needs something sweet." It was the most convoluted, roundabout apology May had ever heard, and it was, in its own way, perfect. It was an offering of peace, wrapped in the practical, unsentimental language of the West. To refuse it would be an act of war. To accept it was to allow the community to begin stitching itself back together. "That is very thoughtful of you, Mrs. Larkins," May said, her voice gentle. She took the basket, the warmth of the cake radiating through the cloth. "Jesse will be thrilled. I will tell him it is from you." The storekeeper gave a short, jerky nod, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She turned without another word and marched back toward town. Her duty done, the surrender was complete. The official resolution came a week later, delivered by a deputy from the county seat, the original boundary marker, now excavated and verified by the magistrate's own surveyors, had been declared the true and legal line. The fraudulent deed filed by Caleb Wright was nullified. He was facing a trial, not just for the fraud, but for the conspiracy and arson, with the testimony of Adair Pike's captured men sealing his fate. The deputy also brought a message for May, the magistrate, having been greatly impressed by her testimony and her conduct, was inclined to be lenient on the sentence. Should she have a recommendation, the letter was a recognition of her as the moral victor in the conflict. That evening, she and Eli sat at the kitchen table and composed a reply. They did not ask for prison time. "Caleb has a wife and 2 young daughters," May wrote. Eli nodding his agreement beside her. "To send him away would be to punish them for his crimes. We ask instead that he be sentenced to a term of public service. Let him spend 1 year rebuilding every fence his partner tore down, and every barn his greed sought to destroy, starting with our own. Let justice be about mending what was broken, not just punishing the one who broke it." Eli's own act of diplomacy was quieter, and took place not in a courtroom, but in the open air. He sent word to Adair Pike that he wished to speak with her. They met on the ridge between their properties, 2 solitary riders against the vast sky. It was not a meeting of friends, but of survivors who understood the harsh calculus of the land. "You have your fence," Pike said, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. "And you have your cattle," Eli replied, his tone even. "They still need to move with the seasons. A fence is a wall. It can keep trouble out, but it can also trap it in." He pointed to a low spot in the valley. "I will build a gate there, a strong one. I will give you a key. In the spring and the fall, for 2 weeks, you can move your herds through my land to the high country. The rest of the year, the gate stays locked. It is a better solution than cut wire and scattered herds for both of us." Pike stared at him for a long time, his expression unreadable. He had expected animosity, threats, a continuation of the war. He had not expected a practical solution. "You are a better man than I gave you credit for. Thatcher," he said finally, a grudging respect in his voice. He reached out his hand, and the 2 men shook, sealing a truce that was more binding than any legal document. The most profound healing, however, took place within the quiet heart of the Thatcher ranch itself. The sound of Jesse's voice, once a rarity, began to fill the spaces that had been empty for so long. One afternoon, Tom Miller rode out to offer his help with the barn raising, and Jesse met him at the corral, his face alight with excitement. "Did you see Silver Gal on your way here?" the boy asked, launching into a long, detailed story about the wild mare, her cleverness, her courage, and the way she seemed to watch over their house. The story was embellished with a child's fantastic imagination, but it was full of life and joy. Tom listened with a wide smile, and Eli, who was nearby, stopped his work, a look of profound, quiet gratitude on his face. Later that day, as May was hanging laundry, she heard a peal of pure, unrestrained laughter from the boy as Eli chased him around the yard. The sound was so beautiful, so long absent, that it brought tears to her eyes. The house was no longer hollow. May felt the changes in herself as well. She moved with a new confidence, a new sense of purpose. When the neighbors arrived for the barn raising, she was the one who organized the food, who directed the work crews, who seemed to be at the center of the bustling, hopeful activity. The woman who had once tried to make herself invisible was now the calm, steady heart of a community effort. She had learned that compassion did not mean having no boundaries, and that strength did not mean closing off her heart. She could be both firm and kind, a leader and a nurturer. The rhythms of their new life together settled into a comfortable routine, punctuated by moments of easy humor. One evening, May came into the kitchen to find Eli staring with familiar despair into a pot of beans. They were, once again, a formless mush. She leaned over his shoulder, a smile playing on her lips. "Well," she said thoughtfully, "to be fair, there is a certain amount of progress here." He looked up at her, feigning indignation. "Progress, they are ruined." "Yes," she agreed, "but they are consistently ruined. You have achieved a remarkable uniformity in your failure. They are all equally mushy. That is a kind of skill." He tried to hold on to his frown, but failed. A laugh escaped him, a deep, rumbling sound. Jessie, who was at the table, giggled. The small kitchen was filled with the warm, ordinary sound of a family sharing a joke. As the ranch was being rebuilt, the town was also being remade. To celebrate the peace and the coming harvest, Alma Ruiz organized a town picnic. She set up long tables in the field behind her eatery. It was her idea that it should be a potluck, a true community meal. She brought a massive pot of her fragrant, hominy-rich pozole, and right beside it, on the table, sat a platter of May's golden, fluffy cornbread. Families who had rarely socialized now sat together, sharing food, their children playing together as the sun went down. The invisible lines that had once divided the town seemed to melt away in the warm, festive air. One cool evening, as dusk was settling in a haze of purple and gold, Jesse was standing on the edge of the porch, looking out at the hills. A movement caught his eye. It was Silver Gal, closer to the house than she had ever dared to come before. She stood at the edge of the yard, her head high, her silver coat seeming to absorb the last of the light. She watched the house for a long time, her intelligent eyes curious and calm. Jesse, his heart beating fast, held out his hand, a gesture of pure, hopeful invitation. Slowly, cautiously, the wild mare took a step, then another. She walked across the yard and stopped just before the porch steps. She stretched out her long neck and gently, with a whisper of warm breath, touched her muzzle to the boy's outstretched palm. It was a moment of impossible, breathtaking connection, a benediction from the wild. May and Eli watched from the doorway, not daring to move. After a moment, the mare lifted her head, gave them one last, long look, and trotted away, disappearing into the twilight as silently as she had come. On a nail beside the door, Eleanor's beautifully braided reins hung, catching the last of the light on their silver conchos. They were no longer a tool meant to capture freedom, but a quiet reminder of its beauty, and of the trust that made it possible. Later, after Jesse was asleep, May stood on the new porch of the half-built barn, looking out at the dark silhouette of the mountains against the star-dusted sky. The land that had once seemed so hostile and unforgiving now felt like a part of her. It was a hard land, but it was an honest one. It demanded strength and courage, and in return, it offered a beauty and a peace she had never known. She thought of the words that had once stung her so deeply, the casual cruelty of being told she was too old to dream. She smiled to herself. They had been wrong. A dream was not some foolish, youthful fancy. A dream was the hard, daily, hopeful work of mending fences, of cooking a meal, of keeping a promise, of learning to forgive. It did not have an age. Only courage had a season. And hers, she realized, had finally, blessedly, arrived. The new barn, a skeleton of fresh-cut pine, rose against the autumn sky, its scent of sawdust a clean, hopeful perfume on the air. The work of rebuilding was hard, but it was a shared labor, a daily testament to the community's mended spirit. Neighbors who had once offered only suspicion now offered their sweat and their hammers, and the sound of their work was a kind of music. One afternoon, when the day's work was done and the last of the helpers had departed for town, Eli found May standing under the great chestnut tree. It was the place Jesse still went to feel close to his mother, a place of quiet memory. May was not trespassing on that memory. She was simply standing in its shade, her presence a gentle continuation of the love that had consecrated the spot. Eli walked over to her, his boots making soft sounds in the grass. He stood beside her for a long moment, watching the way the setting sun filtered through the leaves, dappling her hair with gold. He reached into the small pocket of his waistcoat and pulled something out, holding it cupped in his calloused palm. He opened his hand. Lying there was a simple, unadorned ring. It was not gold or silver, but a dark, burnished gray, forged from a single, twisted piece of iron. It was rough-hewn, imperfect, and beautiful. It was my father's, he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. A blacksmith made it for him from a horseshoe nail, before he could afford a proper ring for my mother. She wore it her whole life, on a chain around her neck. He picked it up, its weight small but solid. It is not fancy, May, but it is as strong as iron. It has seen hardship, and it has endured. He took her left hand, his touch gentle, and looked into her eyes. His own clear blue eyes holding a universe of hope and quiet devotion. "Stay," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Stay and be my wife." The simple word held everything a question, a plea, a promise. It was the offer of a shared future, a life to be built together, as surely and as solidly as the new barn rising behind them. Tears welled in May's eyes, but they were tears of a joy so profound it was almost a form of peace. She smiled, a slow, radiant smile that seemed to light her from within. "I am staying," she whispered, her voice catching. "I am staying to start anew." He slipped the iron ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He drew her into his arms, and there, in the quiet shade of the chestnut tree, as the afternoon light turned to gold all around them, they sealed their promise with a kiss that was as calm and as deep as the land itself. Their wedding, a week later, was not a grand affair. It was a gathering of souls in the newly cleared backyard of the ranch. May, with help from Alma and a few other women from town, had strung up bunting made from the colorful scraps of calico and cotton from her sewing basket, a cheerful, patchwork banner that danced in the autumn breeze. The entire town seemed to be there, not as spectators, but as participants. It was a potluck, and the long trestle tables groaned under the weight of the community's offerings. Mrs. Larkins's famous apple pies, Alma's savory tamales, roasted chickens, fresh-baked bread, and jars of preserved peaches. Reverend Howell stood before them, his Bible in his hand, a warm smile on his face. His words were few, but they were chosen with a poet's care. He spoke not of contracts or laws, but of the quiet, daily work of building a life together, of the courage it takes to plant a seed in hard ground, and of the grace that allows it to grow. When Eli and May said their vows, their voices were clear and strong. A simple promise made before the community that had become their family. In the weeks that followed, their new partnership extended beyond the boundaries of their ranch. May, seeing the constant worry over water rights and the damage caused by overgrazing, had an idea. She proposed it at the next town meeting, a community well, to be dug in a central location. Its use to be shared and regulated by a town council. It would be a fund for the town's most precious resource, a way to ensure that no single rancher would face a drought alone. The idea, born of her own experience of hardship, was met with overwhelming approval. Eli's seasonal gate agreement with Adair Pike was also formally adopted as a town ordinance, a piece of practical, hard-won wisdom written into the local law. Then came a piece of news that sent a final, gentle ripple through the community. A letter arrived from the railroad company, after much deliberation and a new survey of the mountain passes. They had decided that the most practical route for their main spur lay through the next valley to the east. Dry Creek would not become the bustling, chaotic railroad hub that Caleb Wright had gambled everything on. The Thatcher land was safe. For a day, there was a strange sense of anticlimax, but it was quickly replaced by a different kind of news. While the town would not get the main spur, its new, more stable reputation had not gone unnoticed. The Postal Service had authorized the opening of a permanent post office in Dry Creek, guaranteeing a daily mail coach and a direct, reliable link to the world beyond the plains. It was not the boom the speculators had wanted, but it was something far better, the promise of slow, steady, and genuine growth. The town would not be a temporary stop on the way to somewhere else. It would be a destination in its own right. The seasons turned. The new barn was completed, its fresh pine smelling sweet in the cold, crisp air of early winter. On the front porch of the house, the hurricane lamp still hung from its nail. Its glass chimney was always clean, its reservoir always full of oil, but it was rarely lit anymore. The true light, the real warmth, now came from within. from the steady, cheerful glow of the kitchen fire that burned from morning until night, the undeniable heart of a home that was no longer hollow. Life settled into a comfortable, loving rhythm. Eli, for all his newfound happiness, never quite mastered the art of cooking beans. May would sometimes find him staring into a pot with a look of comic bafflement as she came in from the garden. One day, Jesse, who was now writing with a confidence that delighted his teacher, took a small piece of slate and carefully wrote a message on it. He propped it up on the stove, right next to the offending pot, in his careful, childish script. It read, "Do not touch Mama's pot." The three of them stood in the kitchen, and their shared laughter rang through the house, a sound as warm and as welcome as the fire in the hearth. They had learned that no one is ever too old to dream. They had discovered that a dream is not a flight of fancy, but the patient, daily labor of mending what is broken, of sharing a meal, of keeping a promise, and of having the courage to forgive. It was in the quiet strength of their life together, in the simple, profound justice they had fought for, that the true promise of the West was fulfilled not as a place to get rich, but as a place to be whole. One late afternoon, as the sky was turning a soft, pearlescent pink, May stood on the porch, looking out at the land that was now her home, in the distance, by the creek. She saw a flash of silver. It was Silver Gal, her coat gleaming in the fading light. The mare stood for a moment, the wind teasing her mane, a creature of pure, untamed freedom. She was not a possession to be captured, but a spirit to be honored. May placed a hand over her own heart, feeling its steady, even beat, a rhythm as constant and as hopeful as the turning of the earth. The West keeps moving. So do we. Thank you so much for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from in the world so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to my channel Wild West Night. Like this video. And support us further by pressing the hype button so this story and video can be heard by more people.